Remember Skylanders? This was the first major company to kick off the whole Toys to Life gimmick in video games. It went from being one of the biggest gaming trends to slowly, painfully withering away into obscurity. So in this video, I'm going to be playing every single mainline Skylanders game, just to figure out exactly what happened to this series. Was it the games themselves that killed the franchise, or was the gimmick just a phase in the gaming industry? Let's find out. First, let's take a look at Skylanders Spyro's Adventure, the first game in the series. This game was developed by Toys for Bob, the masterminds behind such legendary hits, such as Madagascar 2 and 102 Dalmatians, Puppies to the Rescue. They originally pitched the idea to Activision and got the green light to make a new Spyro game, and then didn't. Technically. Instead, they threw Spyro into an entirely new series called Skylanders, possibly just using him as a marketing ploy to boost initial sales. The idea was simple: make plastic toys, then put them into video games, and thus the Toys to Life concept was born. And my 9-year-old self desperately needed in on this. My first time playing this game wasn't even my own system. A friend brought their Skylanders over, and it was magical. I was instantly addicted. Fun fact, I actually wasn't allowed to have Skylanders when I was a kid, as my parents deemed they were too spooky. I mean, just look at this. It's horrifying. Eventually, my brother and I wore my parents down and got the starter pack, and we spent hours going through levels and upgrading Skylanders. But honestly, looking back, I'm convinced that as a kid, the game itself wasn't even the main source of fun. A huge part of the experience was the figure collecting. It was an absolute blast going to the store and hunting down rare variants, like these see-through ones or the oddly colored ones. Unfortunately, as life went on, I eventually sold all the games and a bulk of the figures. And let me tell you, reacquiring them was an entire challenge, and an expensive one. I found Skylanders Spyro Adventure for Wii for $7. That's cheaper than a cup of coffee. So after hunting down a working portal, buying a ton of figures on Marketplace for $2 a pop, and giving them a thorough clean, I was ready to start. And when I first opened the game, the nostalgia hit hard. The music, the opening cutscenes, the sheer joy of summoning a Skylander from the portal. It was just as magical as I remembered. The story was also surprisingly solid. You, the Portal Master, must stop chaos from taking over Skylands. It's not a mind-blowing plot, but it's fun, quirky, and just the right amount of silly for all ages to enjoy. And that's important to remember. The story just really wasn't that bad. The gameplay loop is simple but addictive. Levels range from 5 to 15 minutes long, packed with puzzles, enemy fights, and the occasional elemental gate. Those doors that mock you for not owning a Skylander of the right type, you better believe they're here. Because yes, that's right, these doors would only open if you had a figure of the correct element. Basically encouraging kids like me to beg their parents for a slam bam, just so I could unlock this water door. His name is now Salt. Everyone say hello, Salt. Hello, Salt. Hi, Salt. That's right, each character had a specific element. There was fire, water, magic, tech, and more. The game was still totally beatable without unlocking these elemental doors, but you definitely felt like you were missing out. Except you really weren't. Actually going through these doors was pretty pointless, since all you get were these hats that slightly tweaked your Skylander stats. It wasn't worth it. Also, I don't like how the hats look on Skylanders. Like, bruh. And since I was playing this on Wii, I was surprised by the sheer amount of Wii gimmicks. Things like shaking the Wii remote to open chests or pointing at the screen with the cursor. It kinda caught me off guard, especially knowing that this game was also on other platforms. Now let's talk about characters. The original lineup had 32 Skylanders, each with unique abilities. And of course, we all have our favorites. And throughout our Skylanders adventure today, I have the absolute GOAT, Dwayne. I love him. Just look at him. Each character is incredibly unique, with their own completely distinct movesets for battling, and surprisingly, when you're actually fighting, the combat feels really good. It's tight, responsive, and weirdly addicting. Even better, as you fight off swarms of enemies, you gain XP, leveling up your Skylanders. As you level up and as you collect gold throughout the game, you can upgrade different aspects of the character, mainly their fighting moves. And let me tell you, this feels so rewarding. And the fact that your progress is just stored on the figure itself genuinely felt magical when I was a kid. And right now as an adult, you could even bring your character to someone else's game and all your save data would still be there. I genuinely believe this gameplay mechanic is what made owning these figures so cool. It felt like you were training the toy itself. And even up until the end of Skylanders, every game kept the ability to upgrade your characters. Throughout the levels, you could also find these things called soul gems, which unlocked additional special moves for a specific character. This made exploring and hunting down every nook and cranny of a level pretty fun, especially if you actually own the character you just unlocked an upgrade for. As for the graphics and performance, I can't bash it too much because, you know, it's a Wii game, but for a Wii game, it's pretty visually appealing. I have to give it that. The performance, on the other hand, was pretty rough. Now, I played it on the Wii, but this was also available on PlayStation and Xbox, both of which were far superior when it comes to performance. So in this sense, I kind of have to give it a pass, but the frame rate is just, oh my goodness. There's also a Battle Arena, which lets two players duke it out with their Skylanders. My brother and I played this mode a ton as kids, and it was absolutely insane. We used to put the names of the Skylanders in a hat, and then we'd draw which Skylander we would use for battle. It was so much fun. So many good memories. Overall, this game has an addictive gameplay loop, some surprisingly funny and engaging story elements, and fantastic music. Seriously, fantastic. I used to listen to this soundtrack on the way home from school on my iPod Touch. That's how you know it's good. Skylanders Spyro's Adventure is a solid start to this series. It's easy to see why it became such a cultural phenomenon. Sure, it has its flaws, but there's a reason my 9-year-old self and my current self was obsessed with it. For a first attempt at a brand new concept, this game is honestly great, and I had a blast with it. It's hard to nitpick and find anything glaringly bad, considering this was the first shot of such a massive idea. The most noticeable flaw was how repetitive it could get sometimes, and there was just a certain lack of direction in some cases. But still, they set the bar pretty high. The reception of this game was also very positive. This was the first time gamers had seen a game like this actually work. It genuinely felt like a magical experience, and the fact that you could just collect actual toys was a collector's dream. The gameplay was fun, the characters were creative, and the figures looked awesome on the shelf. And the team at Activision knew they had a success on their hands because just 1 year later, the team at Toys for Bob went absolutely ham, creating an entirely new game with new level designs, a new story, and heck, an entirely new lineup of characters. The turnaround time was insane. For the sequel of the game, we have Skylanders Giants. The gimmick of the game? You guessed it, giants. They even light up! I'm not even gonna lie, I still don't know how they do this. These figures were massive compared to the originals, standing as physical proof that size does matter. But only in Skylands. The story in Giants picks up right where Spyro's adventure left off. Chaos, the main villain, returns after being banished to Earth in the previous game. This time he discovers the secrets of the Archaeans, an ancient robot civilization, and he's using their tech to take over the Skylands. And guess what? It's up to you, the Portal Master, to save everyone. I actually did like the story in this one though. I thought it was pretty interesting the way they introduced the new Skylanders into the mix. Now, the gameplay in Giants builds on the solid foundation of the first game. You're still solving puzzles, fighting waves of enemies, and exploring colorful levels, but this time the addition of Giants shakes things up a little bit. These characters bring a real sense of power. You feel OP, and just like the first game, you can still upgrade your characters, which keeps the progression satisfying. There's also the new Feats of Strength challenges, where Giants perform tasks like pulling floating islands closer or moving massive objects. It's a cool way to highlight their abilities, but these segments don't always have the excitement you'd expect from such a large-scale gameplay. The gameplay itself is largely the same, but some environmental changes make the game feel vaster. And while they added a lot of cool tweaks to the core gameplay, they also did something that I absolutely hate. They added Sky Stones. Sky Stones is a grid-based card game that you're forced to play throughout Giants. The premise is simple. Place stones on a grid and try to control the board. While that might sound fun and some people might enjoy it, I didn't at all. It's slow, it's tedious, and it completely interrupts the flow of the game. And it's even worse in local co-op because it's just a single player minigame you're forced to play. It just feels shoehorned in and has always been the worst part of the game, and it still is. Honestly, this was my biggest gripe with this installment. Visually, Giants is a noticeable step up from its predecessor. The environments are more detailed, the lighting is richer, and the character models overall look better. Now, of course, I'm not playing this on the Wii. I chose to play this one on the Wii U, which is obviously more powerful. This version has very similar graphics to the Wii version, with enhanced resolution, making everything much sharper. But it's still a Wii U, and the Wii U version struggles pretty hard with performance. Frame rate drops are very common, especially in local co-op. Almost the entire time, the game struggled to maintain a locked frame rate. And while it was still enjoyable, this was definitely noticeable. Now, one of the big things about Giants is its backwards compatibility. You can bring your old Skylanders into the new game, complete with higher level caps and new upgrade paths. It makes the transition between the games feel seamless. And you know what that means? Dwayne is back! And guess what? He talks now. What the heck? Yeah, they went back and added some voice acting to some of the characters, which solidified character personalities and generally gave these characters so much more life. They also introduced a bunch of new Skylanders to the game. The new roster includes 8 Giants along with a mix of regular Skylanders, bringing the total figure count to a staggering 48. Looking back now, I definitely feel like they probably should have added a little more than 8 Giants, one for each element, but whatever. And yes, just like the first game, the elemental gates are still here, still mocking me for not owning certain Skylanders, and still only giving me the same stupid hats I refuse to put on my Skylanders because I'm a purist. Giants also keeps the arena battles, which is always a fun time. And throughout the story, they even added massive robot fights, where you can take control of the Archaean machines throughout the game. It's a cool concept, but the controls are pretty clunky and the novelty wears off fast. By the third time, it just kind kind of feels like a chore, especially in local co-op. But we had to take a moment to appreciate the music in Skylanders Giants. This game's soundtrack is very important to me. It's fantastic, blending epic orchestral pieces with whimsical melodies that perfectly fit the tone of the game. I stand by the claim that this could be one of the best soundtracks in gaming. In fact, I even had the Skylanders Giants theme play at my wedding. I'm not kidding. Skylanders Giants is a solid sequel that expands on the original in meaningful ways. The introduction of Giants adds a new layer of strategy, and the backwards compatibility is a huge win for players that played the first one. While it has its flaws, Sky Stones, it's still a fun and engaging experience. Once again, just like the first game, this was received very positively. It was more Skylanders, but at the same time, people said it felt a bit like DLC. The gameplay didn't evolve that much, and while the additions were great, it wasn't a massive leap forward. Was it better than Spyro's Adventure? Yes. It's a bigger version of Skylanders. They improved a lot, added a ton to the characters like voices, but they also threw in little stinkers like Sky Stones. So this is A tier. The next game on the list is Skylanders Swap Force. The main gimmick here is that you can swap the top and bottom halves of every new swappable character. This is insane, and once again, I have no idea how this works. This was the first time that you actually needed to upgrade the portal, as it needed to have a better NFC reader so that it could actually read which part was on the bottom and on the top of the figure. The first thing you'll notice when you boot up the game is the complete graphics overhaul. They completely changed everything. This game was released in 2014, right around the launch of the PS4 and the Xbox One. So having good graphics was such a huge selling point, and they did not hold back. The environments are vibrant, the foliage is detailed, and the characters have actual fur! Look! Salt has fur! Don't even get me started about how good my boy Dwayne looks right now. Look at him go! And this is all while playing on the Wii U version still. Not only did the graphics get an overhaul, but even the UI and menus got a fresh redesign. The character portraits have now all been updated with new art styles, and they look incredible. Everything from the portal screen to the in-game UI has been overhauled for the better. The entire engine had been changed. And let's not forget, this was made 1 year after Giants, but now with a different developer. This is when the franchise started to have two main developers, alternating releases on a 2-year development cycle moving forward. On top of the massive graphical upgrades, we can now jump. That's right, the first two games didn't even let you jump. For a platformer, this was definitely a necessary addition. It allowed the levels to expand in both design and functionality. Suddenly, levels felt more dynamic, and the platforming is actually a thing. In the grand scheme of things, it might not seem like that big of a deal, but for Skylanders, it was revolutionary. Now, let's talk about the main gimmick, swapping. Swap Force introduces 16 new Swap Force Skylanders, each split into a top and a bottom half. You can mix and match these halves to create unique combinations with different abilities. It's a fun and surprisingly strategic addition, especially when certain parts are tailored for specific challenges. There are also these new gameplay segments tied to the lower halves of Swap Force figures, like flying through the sky with rocket legs. It's not exactly thrilling for co-op player the entire time. While player 1 gets the exciting task of dodging obstacles or navigating tricky sections, player 2 can often get left doing, well, mundane tasks, like making already easy ring targets even easier, but at least it's still here. Something I noticed in these Swap Force levels is that they're actually a little bit longer, but far more diverse than before. Each stage definitely feels like its own adventure with distinct themes and mechanics. And yes, tree grinding. Ooh. Now, while this game is a huge upgrade, there's one major thing that was unbearable, like honestly, and that's the obnoxious amount of unskippable dialogue. This drove me insane. Every second in the hub world, I'm bombarded with text I can't skip. Even throughout the levels, the game just stops you and forces you to listen. Maybe I'm just being an impatient hog, but dang, there was so much text. The rating was fine, the story was fine, I don't know, whatever. Another thing I liked is the upgraded elemental gates in this game. You don't just get hats anymore. The rewards actually feel meaningful, making exploration that much more rewarding. The Wii U gamepad also got a small upgrade. Remember, because we had the gamepad? It displays stats and objectives like in Giants. Skylanders Swap Force is a fantastic addition to the series. The graphics, new mechanics, and expanded level design made it feel like a true evolution of the franchise. Sure, the text overload is annoying and the multiplayer could use some work. Overall, this is a step forward in a modern direction for Skylanders. Skylanders. And while the character swapping ability is definitely a cool mechanic, it didn't really add too much outside of basic attacking and the gates you enter. I didn't actually find myself swapping characters most of the time. I was just more enthralled by the stunning visuals and upgrades and the fact that Salt has hair. The gimmick is cool, but gameplay-wise it wasn't as interesting as I initially thought it would be. Now let's talk about the reception of this game. It was amazing. People loved it. This felt like a new Skylanders game, and largely considered the peak of Skylanders. This was by far the best received game in the series. The levels were bigger, the combat was better, and the game felt more polished. But for me, it's still an A. Why are these all A? Even though I did glaze it up, I don't really have a burning passion to revisit it. But before we move on, if you want to see early access to these videos, exclusive content, and help me financially cover from all the Skylanders I bought, please consider becoming a channel member. You can even get perks like having your name at the end of the video permanently and joining a chat room where your boy is active. So please join the Vandies and click the join button or hit the first link in the description. I'll see you there. All right, back to the video. Next up, we have Trap Team. Boy, did I have a painful time getting this game. First of all, for all these games, I bought them on eBay and they all arrived just fine. I was initially planning on shooting this video and playing all these games within a couple of days, but getting just Trap Team alone took literal months. When my first copy arrived, I popped it in, ready to play, and the game was broken. Just completely broken. Swap Force was also broken the first time I tried, but that was easily replaceable. No big deal. Trap Team was a different story. So I eventually found another copy of Trap Team for Xbox One. It was a bit on the pricier side, but hey, it's fine. I was excited to try it out, and I figured the graphics would be a nice upgrade from the Wii U version. So I put the disc in, booted it up, and discovered none of my portals were compatible with Trap Team. It needs to be the Traptanium portal. Okay, fine. So I finally found someone selling a Traptanium portal for Xbox. I brought it home, plugged it in, finally ready to play, and it still didn't work. Why? Because I got the Xbox 360 Traptanium portal instead of the Xbox One Traptanium portal. That's right, there's literally two separate Xbox portals. And when I went to look up how much the Xbox One portal was, I almost died. Needless to say, I wasn't about to drop over $100 on a portal, especially when buying another copy of the Wii U version and a portal to go with it was cheaper than the portal alone. I have no idea why there needs to be two separate Xbox portals, but that's what happened. I then tried to buy a new Wii U copy that would work and hunt down a Wii U portal for cheap. I managed to find the portal for pretty cheap, but then the only place I could buy the game was eBay. I tried every local game store and nothing. And after I finally bought it from eBay, it took forever to get here. Here in Canada, our postal service went on strike because apparently they can just do that. Anyway, after a few months, I'm finally playing through the rest of these games. Trap Team is one of the only Skylanders games that never really stood out to me as a kid. By this point, I was fully invested in living the hardcore Disney Infinity life and spending all my money on those figures. This iteration of Skylanders just wasn't on my radar at all. Most likely because of the gimmick, which even to this day doesn't sound very interesting to me. Now, before I get into this, I've heard people say that this game is peak Skylanders. And sure, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, though I think it's wrong. The gimmick here is traps. You can defeat bosses and then you can play as them, which, okay, great. Basically, you're just trapping enemies, but not any enemy, only a set amount of them. You can't just walk up to a random grunt and take control. Instead, they're usually bosses that can be trapped, like the boy Gulper. It's an interesting concept, but at the same time, to me it seems like one of the most nothing gimmicks in the series. I don't want to be too harsh on it, because it's still a cool idea and debatably better than Skylanders Giants. But in terms of gameplay, it adds very little. When you're actually playing as a trapped enemy, you get to fight as them and use them like an actual Skylander, only for a limited amount of time. And that just seems like a weird decision to me. Why introduce a whole gimmick and then limit how much you can actually use it? But also at the same time, the only thing you can do with these trapped enemies is play as them. You can't upgrade them, you can't level them up, which just makes me beg the question, why? Why would I even want to play these in the first place? I didn't actually find a single situation where I'd rather use a trapped enemy over a Skylander I'd been grinding out to reach a higher rank. Now, sure, your Skylanders still level up when you play as the traps, but still, I just don't get the big deal with this gimmick. Sure, they add some side quests to the main story and stuff like that, but I don't know. And by the way, these traps were why I needed the Traptanium portal. I was using the Superchargers portal, which I initially thought would work since it could scan traps, but no, I needed this portal. Why, you might be asking? Well, this portal has a speaker, which I absolutely despise. But before we get to the portal speaker disaster, let's take a look at the new Skylanders introduced in this entry. This game introduces Trap Masters. These are bigger Skylander figures than previous installments, and just barely smaller than Giants. These are the main characters of this this game, aside from the traps. Well, aside from their increased strength, these guys all wield crystal weapons, all made of traptanium. And the only real thing these characters add to the game is the ability to access new gates. So yes, these gates are there, and they're not technically necessary to complete the game either. Now, as for the overall gameplay, compared to the previous installments, it feels much like the other Skylanders games. The levels are basic platformers that feature easy to solve puzzles, non-stop enemy bashing, and the occasional key puzzle, which has been slightly improved since the previous games. They get jetpacks now. Whoa. The level design in this version didn't feel nearly as dynamic or interesting as the last installment either. A lot of the time, it felt like you were just walking down basic paths to reach the end. Now, don't get me wrong, there were definitely some interesting levels, but overall this felt a little underwhelming in comparison. Maybe it could have been the shock of how good Swap Force was compared to the Giants, but this one just felt a little underwhelming. But now let's take a look at the story. This is where, for some reason, this game fully leaned into the fact that it was a kids game. I could kind of feel it was starting in Swap Force, but now there's no denying it, this story was made for kids. Because, well, it was just kind of bad. The opening wasn't nearly as gripping as the previous entries either, or even the future games. It starts with you at Skylanders Academy, where this captain guy says lines like, "Holy guacamole!" Holy guacamole! And the problems the story introduces feel so forced. Like they just couldn't come up with anything better. Take the first level, for example. There's this big enemy named Gulper who drinks soda. Oh, because soda's so bad. Enemies drink soda. Oh no. Oh. This is just what bad guys named Gulper do, apparently. In order to defeat him, we Skylanders have to trick him into drinking a poisonous soda that just so happens to be sitting right next to the normal stuff. And also, why are there just massive vats of soda in barrels anyway? You see, it just feels forced. Too forced. But at the same time, I'm the one sitting on the floor playing with a bunch of toys. So look who's talking. Speaking of these toys, let's talk about the portal. Remember the speaker I mentioned earlier? Well, surprisingly, the speaker itself isn't the problem. In fact, I actually like what they did with it. I think it's a cool mechanic. Using the speaker, they definitely made it feel like the enemies were trapped inside the crystals using the audio effects. And they really leaned into it with the speakers a lot during the gameplay. Which now makes me understand why it's necessary. The whole entire game revolves around us hearing what's in these speakers. It's not technically necessary, but it would be weird if it wasn't here. The problem I had with the speakers was the writing. It made me want to throw this thing into this pond. Just like the rest of the game, the writing is awful. Just listen.
Hello? Can anybody hear Gulper? And if so, can you bring Gulper some soda?
I don't know what else to tell you, it's just not funny. Everything these people are saying in the crystals is not funny. Now when it comes to the writing, I'm happy to say that they finally let me skip a majority of the dialogue. Like I said, this was a huge issue in Swap Force that really put a dent in the experience for me. So I'm glad they added it here for dialogue that isn't very important. And that's just one of the little quality of life updates that this actually has. Graphics and performance though, as mentioned, I'm playing this on the Wii U, which is trying really hard to keep up with the current gen consoles. And to be honest, for a Wii U game, it looks pretty good, just like Swap Force. And a lot of visual upgrades from that carry over here. They even continue to tweak certain characters, like Trigger Happy, who for some reason now flips when he jumps. Oh, and of course, we can't forget to check up on Dwayne. He's pretty much the same. Now, some of the graphics do feel a little downgraded. For some reason, I don't think the fur is as furry. Minor things like that, I probably wouldn't fully notice unless I looked at it side by side. The performance though, it's not great. There are constant frame dips, especially during battles, and they happen a lot. This is almost certainly the Wii U's fault, so it kind of sucks to see it here, but it was still playable, just very noticeable. The most noticeable downgrade when it comes to the graphics is definitely the resolution. It's pretty low, probably under 720p or so. Now speaking of the Wii U, the gamepad actually does something interesting. The Skylander you trapped in the crystal shows up on the gamepad and you can interact with them. Let's just say smacking a little Gulper in the face is now an option. Overall, this is definitely the least innovative gimmick that I've seen. This game definitely felt overrated when I was researching it, and these sale numbers kind of prove that this wasn't exactly a fan favorite. In fact, Trap Team was the first Skylanders game that didn't outsell its predecessor, and that really reflects where the Toys of Life community was at the time. By this point, getting a fourth game in just 4 years, each one introducing new gimmicks, new figures, and new mechanics, was starting to feel a little overwhelming for the average consumer. And let's be real, the Toys of Life industry was getting more and more crammed with competitors. The reception of this game was also mixed at the time. People did enjoy collecting the traps, but in order to collect every villain, you had to buy multiple multiple traps, which I honestly never even thought about. And in today's landscape with how expensive these traps are, you just can't, unless of course you actually make money. Become a member. It was also criticized because the villain gimmick wasn't as deep as people had hoped, making it feel, well, gimmicky. For me, this one goes in C tier. Next we have Superchargers. This was one of my favorites back in the day. I absolutely devoured this game, and the biggest reason was Donkey Kong and Bowie Kachowie. I still remember the Nintendo Direct where they announced these guys as playable figures, and not only were they Skylanders, but they were also amiibo with a switchable base. Like, how does that even work? On top of that, they each got their own dark variants in the dark Nintendo versions of the game. Oh yeah, and if you wanted to play these characters, they needed to be on a Nintendo system. Not only did they get variants, but they also got their own vehicles, and Donkey Kong's even had Diddy Kong. That's right, Diddy in the house. Which brings me to the main gimmick of the game, vehicles. And this was a fantastic idea. I mean, what else could they do with the figures at this point? Vehicles were just such a unique and creative addition. They came in these three types: ground vehicles, sky vehicles like planes, and boats. We love boats. Now let's take a look at the new Skylanders this time around. For the first time, they didn't release any core Skylanders without a gimmick. Instead, we got all new figures and redesigned Supercharger Skylanders, which actually made every new Skylander feel unique. Now you might be asking, if the vehicles are the main gimmick, what makes Supercharger Skylanders unique? Well, first of all, the overall combat feels way more fleshed out for most of them. But the biggest thing was the vehicles they released with. You see, each Skylander Superchargers figure had a vehicle paired with it. So if a Skylander was paired with their own vehicle, they get to supercharge it, which pretty much just means making it more powerful. You can use any Skylander with any vehicle you want. The pair will supercharge it. So that's the new gimmick. While it doesn't affect the characters too much, it's definitely the most refreshing so far. But how well does it actually fit into the gameplay? Well, first off, the game is once again very similar to previous entries. You walk along a mostly linear path, solve some pretty easy puzzles, and fight an onslaught of enemies every 2 seconds. This part of the gameplay feels very familiar, but Superchargers has something about it that I really like, and it's hard to put my finger on. First off, the level design compared to Trap Team is leagues ahead in my opinion. The levels feel more eerie and grand, and that atmosphere is complemented really well by the gimmick. Now again, I am also nostalgic for it, and it has Bowser and Donkey Kong, so do I even need to say more? Throughout each level, you'll be using the vehicles, and it's awesome. The interesting thing about this is that even though there are 3 different types of vehicles, ground, water, and air, only ground vehicles are necessary to complete the game. That's because the ground vehicle was the only one included in the starter pack. If you want to get 3 stars on each level, you'll need an air and a sea vehicle to access their respective gates. But unlike some previous games where elemental gates just gave you a dumb hat, Superchargers actually makes these sections fun. The ground vehicle sections are split into 2 types. First, you have the open level segments where you hit ramps, fight enemies with your vehicles, and complete objectives to move on. Then there are the fast-paced racing style sections where you literally blast through a racetrack, dodging obstacles, shooting enemies, and drifting and boosting your way to the finish. It's actually incredible. The controls are tight and the handling is very smooth, and boosting from a drift and flying off a ramp never gets old. It's honestly just addicting. I literally just sat there and practiced drifting and boosting. It was fun. The flying sections are also great. Definitely not as intricate or interesting as the ground sections, but that's probably because they knew everyone else would need to be playing the ground sections to beat the game. That's not to say flying is bad. Out of the 3, it's probably the weakest. It's fun to have dogfights and boost through a small aerial course, but the controls make it less dynamic than the other 2. It's just not as engaging. The sea sections are really interesting in their own right. You can tell they put effort into making them feel floaty, actually replicating the sensation of driving on water. It sounds obvious, but that's not an easy thing to recreate in a video game, so I gotta give them props for pulling it off. Just like the ground sections, these are split between open map combat sections where you fight enemies and even go underwater, and linear racing sections where you can navigate obstacles and dive beneath the surface to avoid hazards. It's really satisfying to master. It's not as good as the ground sections, but it's definitely better than the air ones. But you don't just drive the vehicles. You can also upgrade them. That's right, as you play, you'll collect these silver gear things, which you can use to upgrade your vehicle stats. And throughout each stage, you can unlock new weapon parts as well, which can change things like handling, speed, and other key attributes. They really went above and beyond with these, making them feel like an entire extra Skylander instead of just an add-on. I think the gameplay loop this time around is just solid. It gets right to the point and is straightforward. There aren't a ton of random things going on, just the classic collectibles, but they all have a purpose and don't feel like they're just there to pad out the runtime. Now, what about the story? Get this. It's not actually bad. Okay, so yes, this game is still made with kids in mind, but an adult such as myself, if you would like to call me that, can actually enjoy it for what it is. Mainly because unlike Trap Team, this isn't so childish that I can barely stand it. For example, the opening is actually pretty engaging. It starts with you blasting through a portal, and it's up to you to save everyone from being kidnapped. It's just not a bad plot. I'd be lying if I said there weren't some parts that were a little too childish, but for the most part, I didn't really mind it. I was at least more patient with this one for some reason. Now, what about the graphics and performance? Well, just like the other games, there are a ton of subtle graphical differences, like the hair. Every game, I swear there's less and less hair. Everything looks a little more plasticky, if that makes sense. Once again, we're on the Wii U, so who knows if this is a stylistic choice or just a hardware limitation. The resolution, though, seems noticeably higher compared to Trap Team, at least from what I can tell. But the best improvement of this game is actually how much better it runs. In fact, I'm surprised with the sheer amount of things happening on screen, it runs this well. I'm assuming this is most likely because Nintendo had their IPs tied to the game, so they gave it a little bit of that extra polish. And no, they didn't just add vehicles to the story mode. They added an entire racing mode too. This was Mario Kart 9 before Mario Kart 9. Now, unlike Mario Kart, where you can go from air to ground to water in a single race, here there are 3 separate track types, each requiring you to use a specific vehicle. So if you race with a boat, the entire race is water themed, which makes sense considering you need to have the figure on the portal. I really like that they added this mode in the first place. It's essentially an entire game within a game, giving the vehicles more value and letting you use them without having to play through a level first. As a racing game though, it does feel a little odd. The vehicles handle exactly the same as they do in the main game. It's just that now you're on tracks designed for racing. The usual racing game mechanics are here, like items, drifting, and boosting. But what makes this feel different is that every vehicle has its own weapon built in that you can use all the time. It's not like Mario Kart where if you throw an item, it hits someone and then they spin out. Instead, each player also has a health bar, and only when that health bar runs out do they actually spin out. It's not bad, it's just different. Hands down though, the ground racing is the best one, just because the controls feel more intricate. And honestly, that's what I expected. The use of the items is also kind of weird. Instead of holding an item and choosing when to use it, the game just automatically activates it. As for the tracks, they're also pretty good. The level design is awesome and it genuinely feels like a Skylanders racing game. But speaking of full Skylanders racing games, they actually did exactly that. They made an entire Skylanders racing game with Skylanders Superchargers Racing on Wii and 3DS. Yes, this was on those platforms in 2015. In fact, every Skylanders up to this point had both a Wii and a 3DS version. The Wii ports were always the same but stripped back graphically, while the 3DS versions were completely different from their console counterparts. But this time, instead of making a platformer for these versions, they just took the racing mode from Superchargers and called it a day. Except they didn't just take the racing mode from the other console versions, they completely recreated it. And it's bizarre. Most of the core gameplay mechanics are the same, like the health bar and the constant weapons, but the actual gameplay feels different. What's interesting is that I kind of like the Wii version's gameplay more as a racing game, because it has one job, to be a racing game. It also added a few new mechanics, like jumping. What the heck? And it's actually fun! But they also took stuff out, like, for example, in the sea races when you go underwater, the camera doesn't follow you, and instead of a barrel roll in these sky races, you just get a dash. Minor things like that make it feel a little more like a traditional racing game. They also included these cool little animated movies for the Superchargers when you spawn them in, so that's fun. Regardless, Skylanders Superchargers as a whole is my favorite Skylanders game so far. S-tier alert, S-tier alert. Maybe it's my nostalgia for it, or maybe it's just because it has the Nintendo lads, but undeniably, this is the cleanest, freshest entry yet, and it was really hard to put down. But that's not what other people thought. Somehow the reception for this game was even lower than Trap Team. A lot of people complained that they signed up for an action game and not Mario Kart. Some loved the vehicle mechanics, but others felt it strayed too far away from the original formula. At this point, sales started declining heavily, making it clear that Skylanders was definitely losing steam. Which brings us to the very last Skylanders game, Skylanders Imaginators. When I was a youngin', I remember buying this game pretty close to launch, and just like Superchargers had Donkey Kong and Bowie Kachowie, this one had Crash Bandicoot, my beloved. And it's kind of crazy that on Nintendo consoles, they could actually play together, especially considering that Crash Bandicoot was in the PlayStation bundle. It just doesn't feel right. I don't know. The entire marketing push for this game revolved around creation crystals, which allowed you to create your own Skylanders using the in-game creator. You could customize their heads, arms, legs, color scheme, voice, weapons, you name it. And honestly, the customization was insanely in depth. One of the more interesting decisions was that once you choose a battle class for your Imaginator crystals, like the Knight, Sorcerer, Brella, etc. It was actually permanent. Yes, you could tweak the appearance all you want, but you were stuck with the class you chose from the start. So if you had second thoughts and wanted to switch from a Smasher to a Ninja, too bad. You gotta go buy another crystal. And that brings us to the creation crystals themselves. These were the new figures of the game. Except they weren't figures at all. Instead of collecting fully designed characters, you were just collecting plastic tubes that stored your creation, and they even lit up a little bit. And these weren't cheap either. You needed a different crystal for each element, meaning if you wanted to make a water Skylander and a fire Skylander, you had to buy both. This just felt weird. Yes, it was cool to create your own Skylander and make it your own. It didn't feel as magical saving your character to the actual Skylander toy itself. Now, to be fair, they did go all out with this feature. They made an entire app to customize your characters. There were blind bags for additional cosmetics. And heck, you could even print cards, t-shirts, and order a physical figure of your Skylander directly from the Skylanders website. They really went for it and tried to do the best they could. While the Imaginators were the new gimmick to create your own Skylander, they also introduced these senseis. These were the more traditional Skylanders. These were pre-made characters who acted as mentors for your Imaginators. Each sensei belonged to one of 10 battle classes and would unlock new moves for your custom characters. But more importantly, they also increased your level cap just by owning them, meaning that if you wanted to max out your Imaginators, you needed to buy a bunch of these guys. Oh my goodness, they really squeezed every bit of juice from your wallet. Some of the senseis were brand new characters, like King Pen. But surprisingly, others were returning villains from Trap Team who are now playable characters, like Wolfgang, Golden Queen, and even Chaos himself, which now goes for an arm and a limb on eBay. Yes, that's right, for the first time in Skylanders history, Chaos was a real figure you could buy and play as. And sure, that sounds cool, but at this point, it just kind of feels like a desperate attempt to get people hyped for the game. Also, it kind of ruins any future that the character has as a villain, doesn't it? Kind of just screams the end is near, to me. The main villain for 6 games is in the game as a playable character. How can they evolve him as a villain in the future games? And it didn't help that the game was missing a key part of the franchise. Remember Trap Team? The reason I bought an entire portal? Yeah, well, Imaginators decided to throw that entire concept in the trash. Any trap you had was completely useless now. And again, they made the old Trap Team villains into physical Sensei Skylanders now. It was probably just a ploy for you to go buy even more characters. I'm broke. Now, they did at least bring back these Supercharger vehicles. They didn't include them into the story or anything, but they brought the exact same kart racing mode from the Superchargers game into this as well. It's literally copy and pasted. Now, they might have just got rid of these so that they didn't have to worry about putting them on the Switch version, because the Switch version didn't actually use a portal at all. In fact, they completely ditched that. But I talk a lot about that when I played Skylanders Imaginators on the Nintendo Switch for a video. I go in depth on all of the Switch quirks because trust me, there are a lot. At its core, this is still a Skylanders game. You run through levels, smash bad guys, solve simple puzzles, and occasionally get sidetracked by side objectives that reward you. The level design is also pretty good. It doesn't feel as dynamic as Swap Force, and the environments aren't as unique as Superchargers. It's just another set of Skylanders levels with some gimmicks sprinkled in to match the Imaginator theme, and that's fine. That's all it really needs to be. But this game falls dangerously close to Trap Team when it comes to the story, and I absolutely hated the story in this one the most. It is the most childish yet. Now, of course, it probably has to do something with the Skylanders Academy TV show that was released on Netflix, and they wanted to integrate that show with the game. I'm sure that had something to do with it, but it was just too forced. Like the Flynn character, who literally only talked about sandwiches, it just got old fast. Or when we're in the Battle Arena mode. Yes, the Battle Arena mode is great for leveling up your character and getting gold and stuff, but dang, the jokes in that the entire time were trash. It's like they were trying to be goofy, and they thought I was a toddler or something. So bad. While this was just a basic Skylanders game, there were definitely things that made it not as good as the previous installments. I think the most noticeable issue was how insanely powerful the senseis and the Imaginators were. And while that might sound like a good thing, it's not. It makes the entire game unbalanced. These new Skylanders are so much more powerful that they make the older Skylanders feel incredibly weak. So weak that I just didn't want to play them anymore because they just didn't have the sauce. And I think that's one of the game's biggest flaws, aside from the cringy story. Another issue that I noticed that hurts my soul is the music. This was the only Skylanders game that didn't have an original soundtrack. Instead, they just reused a bunch of music from previous games, which is really sad, and you can tell there's just a disconnect because of it. Then there's the graphics and performance. The game is practically identical to Superchargers in terms of visuals and performance. There might be a few more frame rate issues in Imaginators, but that just depends on what console you play on. Another thing I noticed is that a lot of the assets are just reused from Superchargers, like the portal screen. It's not a huge deal, but when every previous Skylanders game changed the portal for each installment, it kind of sticks out. Also, Dwayne check, he still looks the same. Throughout my entire Skylanders journey, this was by far the most expensive game to get back into. The figures are expensive due to extremely limited print cycles, and don't even get me started about how much the Switch version costs. It was clear that when this game launched, Activision knew this was it. They made the Switch version have no portal, which basically confirmed they were giving up on the concept. The Switch version literally uses a digital library. And yes, the 3DS ones did technically too, but you couldn't store every single one of your Skylanders on them. And after Imaginators, that was just the end of the Skylanders era. Skylanders was a phenomenon, bringing together toys and video games in a way no one had ever seen before. It revolutionized the gaming industry, kickstarting the Toys to Life boom and proving that a crazy idea like scanning plastic figures into a game could actually work. Now, there are multiple factors of why this could have failed. I think one of the biggest reasons is the entire industry as a whole. Disney Infinity had already came and left. LEGO Dimensions also just appeared and then stopped appearing. Then even Amiibo had a massive boom at the beginning of the era and then just kind of slowly trickled away and is still a thing. Definitely a lot less of a thing than it was. But no doubt, annual releases, figure fatigue, and the oversaturation of the Toys to Life market all contributed to its downfall. It did once feel magical and fresh, but it quickly turned into a costly commitment. And as the audience grew up and the competitors dropped out, it was only a matter of time before Skylanders did as well. Regardless, Skylanders remains an iconic series. I always get nostalgic over Toys to Life, and it's fun to visit such a massive IP like this and see the rise and fall of the series. Also, Imaginators is also C tier. But will Skylanders ever return? I don't know, but at least we still have Dwayne. And if you want to see all the stupid Switch quirks of Imaginators, click here. And for other Toys to Life videos, click here. And once again, please consider becoming a channel member. I hope to see you in the next one. See you later.